2 hours for you though.
3.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, from Arizona, you're right.
Yeah, 'cause we don't move.
Change, yeah.
God, it was just so confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was up at 4.
I
in the
saw that.
morning.
Yeah.
Because that's 7 o'clock, and even that's sleeping in, thinking to call my spouse at 4 while he was at work.
Yeah.
Hey, no, I don't want to be up right now.
Yeah.
Sunrise.
Yeah, that's beautiful, I guess. I wish I could have seen that. All right, I'm gonna put this. Maybe people don't want to see that on the screen, actually. That will be just for me. Oh no, but people won't see because I'll turn that off when, oh no, I can't turn that off. Okay, so yeah, I don't know how I'll do that. I'll do something, I'll do otherwise.
You have a.
I have a phone, so
Oh.
I can do that on my phone actually. Let me do this. Yep. Who's starting?
I don't even know. That's a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, I have the program. I printed everything. It's very bad approach because like I need this for as a human being.
Yeah, that was. I'm realizing that. I'm like, oh, it's not. No, it's not.
So Davis is starting. So if she needs to see people, I'll do it like this.
Isn't she?
I assume that's bad for me to assume, but she's cool because it's.
No, she's not here.
Yeah, but I kind of remember I do have the impression that it was a quote unquote woman's name.
No, I don't think she's physically here.
Yeah, but that's why I'm turning on that side and activating Zoom. Is that even working? Yes. I just need to remove the. That's good, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. No, but it's beautiful. I don't know. I like the perfect. That's good.
Yeah.
So that they can see people. And I'll just share the screen whenever they send their presentation, or like they will share the screen actually. This is the end of emails. No, not yet. We will hear a sound. I need to deactivate the.
Do you need a power cord to get through this, or is this?
Yes, that would be great actually. I'm thinking about it now. Ah, Laure is here. Salut Laure.
Salut, hi.
Hello.
Tu m'entends bien?
Et toi?
Ouais.
Hi,
Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you. My name is Xiao Yongwang.
Yes, I'm Ellie. Nice to meet you.
Are you David? Oh,
No, Ellie.
El-
Did you manage to register at the entrance?
Oh, I registered this.
Okay.
Yeah.
They can.
Hi, nice to meet you. Good morning.
Good morning. Oh, you Jennifer.
Yes, he is doing the tech though.
Oh, okay.
Oh, perfect.
I got a.
That's for the Mac.
Yeah.
And where can I actually have one. They say maybe longer, but I think plug it. Oh, that's something to plug here.
Okay.
Thank you anyway.
Because I don't want it to be like dead by the end of the session.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I could upload my file.
Yes, I'll do that right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Is it Forest Nuclear Medicine PDF?
Oh, it's
This one?
there's something say final. Could you use the time to list the file?
Yes.
Use the up
10th of November.
It's this morning. There's there are two
It's
files.
certified 10th of November 2023.
Oh, that was Taiwan time. So
Oh, yeah. I have no idea. It doesn't say final, but
that's a PDF. I have
Yes.
another one that's a
I
PowerPoint.
prefer. I'm fine with PDF, but yeah, I don't know which file you want to open.
Okay, so could we
show list
yeah.
and then check and then put the ones.
Where's the show?
dates.
Sorry, it's in French, so that the modification is like date of modification.
It doesn't show like a list.
No, sorry, I'm gonna do that for you.
Title.
List. Is that what you were looking
Oh
for?
yeah, then it's easier.
But this is all in French, so I'll have to translate for you.
Oh,
find
it only has the PDF.
I think that's fine. And because this is edited tomorrow, I guess that's the most recent one. It hasn't been edited yet in US time because it's Taiwan
Oh,
time.
yeah, this is the what final one.
Ah,
yeah.
okay. So I'll take the final one. Yeah. Okay.
That's a PDF.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Okay, that'll be fine.
Yeah.
Or check the copy.
Water, but
Purified water.
Okay, I'm gonna give you your USB disk back.
Well,
oh,
you received my paper and
oh, you shouldn't have, but thank you.
something very small.
Thank you.
It's mango. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's fine with you.
Yes, I like mango.
Hey,
Hi.
thanks for coming.
Thanks for hosting. Well, because it's one in here or is there?
No, well, there's.
You want it with you?
I'm not.
You're not. So we have to Laura.
Laura, no, there's only three of us here in person, and Laura and someone else.
There's someone named David.
It's,
I don't know their first name, and I don't know. I'll see if they're connected in a second.
yeah.
So since they're not
Thank
showing,
you so much. Thank
that's
you.
pineapple.
That's perfect. I love pineapple. This is very Hawaiian as well.
Yeah.
So
Are you
very-
from Hawaii?
No, from France.
Oh, you're from France.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's why your computer is in.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. Hey. My friends coming. Hi Tim, nice to see you in person for real.
See you too.
Thank you. Okay. So who do we have online? Davis is Dave. Yeah, I think that's the theory. The question being, is that person connected? We don't have a person, do we? Anything else? Can you check anything else? Yeah. Thanks. Start with someone else. I'll send an email to the volunteers. Oh, actually, Adair,
Yes.
can I ask you for quick help?
What's up?
The person who's supposed to start signed up with an email for Forest. That's not their Zoom account email. Can you please ask what's his name? Who's the guy who saw yesterday?
Should I just send it to the
Yes.
larger channel?
Thanks. Do you have?
I have a desire.
Yes. Can you tell that to the other while I set up the IT? Thank you. So you need to send that to what's his name? Not Joanne, but what's his name? Bronze. Yeah, that's for Bronze.
I want to respond to them saying we're moving the order.
Yeah, should we start then? Yeah, we need on the second thing in this.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then we can work out.
Yeah.
Stuff with your.
Yep. Okay, so I'll start. Hi, everyone online. Can you both hear us and see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll just, yeah, remove that for now, put it like this, and then should be fine. Okay. We'll start in just a minute, sorry. Since I'm starting, I'm going to turn that around. Sorry for the logistical issue. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay and see me online? Sorry, I have to switch the computer on from side to side.
Yes.
Okay, so sorry for the slight delay. Welcome everyone to our panel about emplacements of science, establishing local global correspondences and circulations. There's actually only one part to it because we have had withdrawals, so it's only one panel this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are on the globe. And we were supposed to have Clay Davis starting, but because she's had a problem with her Zoom, we're now having tech people from the conference sorting this out. And so we're just moving along with the order of the presentations. Just to give a very, very brief intro, the aim of this panel is to address a theme that's present in many STS conversations around sense of place, local and global, but not necessarily in terms of resistance of people against scientific projects and against universalistic claims and any project like thinking about universal, but how do scientific infrastructure, and especially those with complex platform systems, establish these negotiations between the local and the global? How do they justify the local relevance of their infrastructure? So Jennifer and I actually have a kind of matching presentation. So we're following the order on the program, which was decided by 4S in a weird manner. But what I'm going to talk about is something that Jen will talk about extensively in terms of one of the case studies about the LEO landscape evolution observatory at Biosphere 2. My picture is a bit larger in terms of different so-called ecotrons, so controlled ecological systems, facilities in ecological sciences. And the idea is to, we used this opportunity that we had when we met in Arizona a year and a half ago at the STS network, and realizing we're both doing some type of social science research about Biosphere 2. Jen was doing research on one of the projects with multidisciplinary scientists at the LEO, working actually as a work package like social sciences sometimes have to do now, thinking in terms of integrating their different scientific cultures. And I was there just to see how Biosphere 2 played within a larger context of ecotrons. So we both had different methods. Jennifer is a sociologist doing a lot of interviews, and I'm doing a lot of ethnography as an anthropologist, if I can see some very basic binary divides, which is not what things are just assumed about, but that's also a difference that we thought could be a point of convergence between the two of our works and like work together. And Tim Sacco, who can't make it today, unfortunately, is a postdoc in Arizona at the Noir Lab, who's working on telescopes. And so that's how at one graduate STS conference day, we just came together thinking we should think together about this idea of infrastructure and platforms in terms of scientific research. this idea of big science, but how people negotiate basically how the instruments and the equipments are meant to be offered to a wider scale audience of scientists, and what should be concentrated at one place versus spread out across the globe in terms of sharing and distributing resources. And the talk I'm going to give today is precisely taking my personal PhD research into that angle. I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. That's the amount of time we give each of the presenters so that we have some time at the end for general discussion. If you do 15 minutes, it's better so that we have like kind of follow-up questions just afterwards. If you do 20, then we'll have maybe more time for questions at the end. So I'm starting my timer now. And what I would like to present to you today is part of this PhD in social anthropology and STS in France, in Paris, at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, and this funded by the CNRS, the French National Center for Scientific Research. And I would like not to talk about one specific ecotron or like one specific field site, but how these different environments, so because my PhD is about experimentation in closed ecological systems that are reconstituted artificially in confined milieus. And how do these different platforms collaborate together? Because there's a kind of irony in that you could think all of them are reconstituting a specific environment that claims for total, global environment, but still they need to have several of them and they don't always do the same thing. So the title is Situating Ecology on the Negotiation of Knowledge Placefulness by Experimental Ecology Facilities, with a nice picture of people trying to think common projects between Arizona and Paris last year at the launch of a common program in Arizona. So how do I move to the next slide? Okay. So traditionally, just to give you a broader context about the emergence of this field of these stations and what my PhD more broadly is about. So ecological science has been framed as a science that was doing long-term field research observations with data collection, sampling, measuring, statistical analysis down the line, but mostly things that were being done outside, quote unquote, going sometimes to remote, quote unquote, places like deep oceans, and basically trying to understand the natural world, the environment in situ. But increasingly, and that's where my field site came as an interesting middle ground, there have also been like what are called stations, places where people are indeed like kind of in outside spaces, but do some type of experimentation or still go to one very specific place and sleep for some time and just like have the kind of base camp from where they can transit and go around. So it's the start of building facilities. And the one I've done the most fieldwork in is very close to Paris, close to Fontainebleau, in Saint-Pierre-les-Nemours, in the Paris region. And this is called the Station de Foljuif. Historically, it belongs to the École Normale Supérieure, which is a French university, French school. And it just started as like a site that was donated by a donor for the rise of biological and natural sciences at that university, at that school. And it started mostly with this kind of research I mentioned outdoors in terms of measuring plants, doing pollination experiments, enclosing small patches of meadows to see if one patch with more nitrogen or more, say, nutrients was influencing the growth of biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems. But progressively, there's been more and more emphasis into having more instrumented and experimental type of ecology, which doesn't come as an obvious thing in the sense that experimentation is something that is costly and that requires a lot of instrumentation. So it's been a very big political affirmation of the discipline of ecology in France, who have this big equipment and dedicates money. So the beginning of my PhD will be about how these debates have played out in the French context, what controversies led to the building of these facilities, and how people had to fight to make ecology a recognized discipline with the legitimacy that experimentation and instrumentation brings to a scientific discipline. So what you can see here is the building of another zone in the station, and this is what is going to be called the ecotron in this Paris region. And what you see here on the first picture I show from above here on the right, these are 5 so-called ecolabs. So it's climate chambers that you can see the inside of here. In each ecolab, so these containers, you have 3 replicated eco units like cells, like the one you see on the left. And in these cells, you can reconstitute environments with, for example, soil columns, small plants. And what's important for them is that you can control lots of environmental parameters like light, temperature, humidity, CO2, and measure very finely the response of the environment. So the idea is really to experiment in a very controlled manner the way in which ecosystems evolve and react. And what's at stake on a local manner on an ecotron is this idea of what should happen in situ, in the sense that this is a platform dedicated to researchers in all ecological disciplines in France and beyond. And so when you go there, it's mostly engineers and not scientists who work there. And these engineers have to decide what's worth keeping in place in terms of material and staff, and because they will reuse it for later experiments. So they don't work in a specific ecological field. What their job is to make these platforms modular and to make commensurability between different subdisciplines. They're not specialists, they're generalists that say themselves of ecology, and their general tinkering allows for the kind of general idea of what an ecosystem is. And we went to like brico markets to just buy material, and they were very creative in building stuff that individual scientists in the subdisciplines didn't know how to take into account. For example, recreating tides is something that can be done individually in studying, say, soil microbiology in mangroves. But when it comes to integrating that with a broader structure of light and heat, the engineers come together in terms of making this ecosystem a reality. So that's what's happening at the scale of one ecotron, already deciding what's relevant in situ at a local level. But then the problem is there are different ecotrons, and all of them have different affordances in terms of what type of ecosystem foci they will really research. And for example, this is the one in Montpellier in the south of France, and you can see it's completely different. It's open to outside light, but it's got a much better way to control and measure, to actually measure some fluxes inside, because they're very much into this idea of respirometry. So you have lots of different legacies and histories, phylogenies of ecotrons, all have the same thing in common, but in this idea of making materializing an ecosystem, but they will not materialize the same things, and they will not have the same debates in terms of which members of the ecological community they work for. So the challenge has been from the beginning to integrate all these environments, and one of the examples is this ANAE network. ANAE means Analysis and Experimentation on Ecosystems, and scientists have themselves wanted to have what they call an experimental chain, where they integrate all the data and experiments together. And so what I want to talk about in this presentation is precisely what are the logics of distribution of experimental ecosystems research across facilities, how do complex research facilities negotiate their playfulness as they collaborate together in spite of their aspiration to produce location-agnostic generalizable knowledge. And so I will give three very short vignette examples to show how this plays out, arguing that what happens in the end is a composite idea of what an ecotron is in terms of building a common prototype by integrating the game of ecotron experimentation. And the first example is harmonization. That's exactly leading into Jen's presentation, because I'm going to talk about Biosphere 2. So last year when I was in Arizona, I had the chance of having the visit of the CEO of the CNRS, launching this international research laboratory between the CNRS in France and the University of Arizona, because apparently they share what they call great global challenges. So we had a lot of champagne, a lot of canapés. It was a very good time. It was in so for those who know University of Arizona, this is the old main at the center of campus. And one of the things that interested Antoine Petit, the CEO of the CNRS, was Biosphere 2, because the CNRS also is one of the tutelages of the ecotrons, and it kind of looks the same. If you haven't heard of Biosphere 2, this is this very controlled environment where people had a great idea, venture capitalists actually, to put 8 people in a dome for a year and a half and to see if by reconstituting different biomes and tropical rainforests and ocean, they would survive, and think about this idea of a minimal ecosystem. Spoiler alert, they did not survive very well, and that's the whole point. They wanted to see what didn't work and what an ecosystem what a minimal ecosystem had to be to make people survive. But today they're still doing individual research on the different biomes. So it looks a bit like ecotron research. And one of the biomes that Jen is going to talk more about is this landscape evolution of the battery. So basically free slopes of basalt, so very rudimental basic soil. And they're trying to investigate ecological succession. So trying to see how the landscape moves and transforms from in a very linear, almost evolutionist manner, from bare soil to non-vascular plants to vascular plants and then lush ecosystems. So I'm actually thinking they're doing terraformation, but I'll let Jennifer talk more about this. What I'm interested in here, and this is a better picture of how it looks like from the inside. This is where the farm of Biosphere 2 used to be. What I'm interested here is how they collaborate. Actually, one of the experiments they are trying to do is to take one aspect of this kind of succession ecology experimentation and have it sent to the ecotron in a more controlled setting. And they wanted to check if the plants they wanted to insert would how they will react with certain soil in more controlled conditions, so that they could upscale and to see whether the results in the ecotron were predicted well what would happen when the plants would be inserted on the actual big slope. So they wanted to like have a mini version of the experiment and have more control over the parameters that regulated what would happen on the big slope. So have a more fine-tuned version. So it implied collaborations between the ecotron and Biosphere 2. So Jen was like doing interviews with people at Biosphere, and I was like attending Zoom meetings between France and Arizona, which was a funny thing in the first place. They sent this graduate student to, she thought she was arriving to Paris. She arrived in Saint-Pierre-les-Namur in the French countryside in the middle of nowhere. And she was like trying to rebuild some of the elements you see on the left here below the Leo slopes, like these auto samplers, and build them again identical in the French context with engineers that didn't necessarily need that and had never done some hydrology type of ecology before. So I don't know exactly how to analyze this perfectly yet, but what I find interesting is this process of imitation and negotiating what should be taken from the money of the French ecotron, what is worth sending people over the Atlantic for, and how much of the imitation you should do of exactly what the Leo is doing. And you could see that also when they send the seeds from the alfalfa plants over the post, which was a funny moment. And most importantly, when they sent on a boat, it took ages, the soil from the actual Leo slopes to the middle of the French countryside through Le Havre harbor. It took ages, and there were so many. I mean, I complained about me arriving in the US with the border control, but this was even worse. It was just basalt, but it was very complicated. But one day in February this year, finally arrived, and they could basically recreate Arizona, the Arizona desert, or Biosphere 2, at least in one of these containers. So this whole play of negotiating how the two places correspond to one another. The second example I want to give is another one called analogical definition. So here we have another example with soil scientists from Idaho, who I visited when I was in Arizona, because they wanted to create a new ecotron. So what happens when you create a new version of an ecotron? Basically, they knew about the concept, and they found money from the NSF, actually not enough to do what they want to do. That's what they've been told. $20 million, I think, which for an ecotron is not so much because it's so expensive. But they got this grant for a kind of light middle ground instrumentation from the NSF, and now they have to understand what to do. So I saw them in Idaho, in Moscow, of all places, and then I came back. They came to Europe to visit all the ecotrons I've been doing like visits in, and I just chaperoned them around the ecotrons to do a kind of meta field work where they were doing the ethnography and I was doing the ethnography of them doing ethnography. So my interest there was to see what they took of the ecotrons they saw. How would they get inspired from this and build their own version of a concept? So we first went to near Leipzig in Germany, and we just saw this one first version that was a bit different because they did like kind of they were interested in deep soil, these Idaho people, and this was just biodiversity on a very more terrestrial, like surface level. So it was just kind of a distant cousin at that stage, but still they kind of trying to realize that Europe invested very much in this kind of research, whereas in the US there is a more big history of wilderness and outdoor experimentation, and they were very scary scared that the US scientists do not understand this idea of like ecological experimentation. It's a big challenge for them in terms of communication. So we talked a lot about that. And then we went to Bavaria, where their prototype was actually being built, and they realized that their version was built by a company that had an idea what ecotrons are, but in a different way. They were like doing the latest version on the market, and what they had to decide was, okay, which subcontractor should we take in terms of this sensor? So they had to think about how to make their own model relativist, their own relativist model in terms of which sensor we integrate, which branch should we include, and how does that change our prototype? And that played even more when we went to Montpellier in the south of France afterwards. And the tech people discussed together, the Idaho and the Montpellier ones. And the Montpellier one was saying, I have experience. And what I can tell you is like, don't go with this subcontractor. They're not very good with post-buying service, like how do you call it? SAV, or like when you buy a product and then you need to call them because there's a problem. I don't know how to say that in English. But so that's kind of small advice that made them realize, okay, we're actually doing something called an ecotron. It's our ecotron, but it's a different version of an ecotron. So by integrating into the game, they were actually contributing to building that prototype and this idea, this model of what an ecosystem facility is. So it's not really about representing the outside world as much as it is about conforming to a standard of experimentation around the globe. So we're kind of like building what an ecosystem is, not based on the ground, but based on an already metaphorical and conceptual version of what an infrastructure is. And when they went to Paris, because that's where Samuel does lots of work on soil, then they were thinking more about what type of experiments they could be doing, also in collaboration with the Paris Ecotron. And finally, very quickly, I want to talk about data, because one of the other goals of these collaborations is to have data pulled together so that there is more convergence between all the experimentations that you can draw knowledge from. And if this ecotron is working on this aspect, if that is working on that aspect, then we can put things together. Abduction is kind of an attempt to use Elmreich's words when he talks about the sampling of ocean genome. It's kind of saying that it's a logical reasoning that's not induction or deduction, but just like taking lots of stuff, hoping that someday we can make some logical inference about that. So it's kind of a lot of projection type of reasoning. So what they're doing at the Paris Ecotron is building for this ANAE network a software that's kind of standardizing all the steps of an experiment so that people can just log in the software and just say what they want to do, and they will be redirected to the ecotron that fits their needs best. And so there's been all these kind of meetings about semantics, asking what are the parameters we should standardize and the names we should use for all these ecotrons. So classic issue of standardization, including for the steps of the experiments. That's the experiments I'm actually doing right now there. They've encouraged me to do my own experiments. So I've also gone through EASIA, the software. And so they have, this very idea of compartments. This is in French, of course, but this idea of, there should be compartments in an ecosystem, and that's what we standardize. And we force conditions, and then we have output in terms of measures. And here we see the different compartments that people should reference in the software. And for an anthropologist, it's very interesting because they actually have an idea of ontology in the IT term way of thinking about this. So it's actually interesting to see how the word is used in a vernacular way by them. And what's interesting here is that they do take into account the context of observation as relevant to produce metadata. And I think this is what makes it different from just standardization, because they want to include the idea that each ecotron, first of all, don't have the same way of phrasing things. So there's this issue of standardizing the semantics, but also integrating the context of who took the observation, how we build a common thesaurus, and how there's an ontology playing around that. So my argument, and I use this picture from UCL linguistic anthropologist Alex Pillen here that Jiva knows, is that there is a kind of evidentiality in this process. And evidentiality is a word used by linguistic anthropologists to talk about these languages, say Amazonian languages, that have a datic reference to what they're referring to. I can't say I'm going here without, it doesn't work if there's no reference to the person who spoke about this. So what Alex Pillen did, and I'm quickly concluding here, is she materialized different languages in terms of how much evidentiality they have. So English would be very poor, and Quechua, by contrast, would be like a lot of evidential. So what I'm saying with this data is that they are evidential of the source of production. So it's not just mere standardization. So it's an interesting way of colliding the ecotrons together. So to conclude, what I want to say is that these ecosystems are sort of hypertextual. Originally, I wanted to say just intertextual. That's the word that Julia Kristeva uses after Mikhail Bakhtin in terms of the dialogical text, in terms of what when texts reference one another. But here, I think there are even like this one of kind of hypertext you see on the internet, in the sense that they only exist in relation by reference to one another, and they create this kind of network above ground, not in relation to the outside world, but in reference to themselves. With first this composite harmonization, this versionified idea of experimentation, and finally this evidential standardization of what we can call data, but it's not given, so it should be called something else, but that's a Lattorian debate, so for some other day. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Yes. This is very speculative. I'm just playing with things. I need to write my PhD, but I'd be very happy to have feedback. It's just, you know, thinking out loud. So that's what this is for. So coming up next, do we have okay, she's managing to overcome the problems. Okay, brilliant. So I'm gonna exit that. How do I do this? I'll stop sharing the screen. And I will launch your presentation on nuclear medicine. So we now have Hisu Yung Wang from the National Cheng Kung University of Taiwan, presenting us on knowledge production in the transition from the colonial era to the Cold War, radioactive iodine in Taiwan. Your file is just opening now. I will just share the screen for people online. So share screen, this, share. Can everyone online see the screen? Hello, can everyone online see the screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, the floor is yours then.
Thank you. Right. So this is okay. Thank you for including my paper in this panel, and I realize it's kind of different, and I do envious Ellie. You could go into the different sites to do your research. For me, I would probably need a time machine to back into 1950s. But I hope somehow we can, my paper can fit into this session a little bit. Probably take some creative thinking. Okay, essentially what I'm interested is the study of goiter in the context of colonial medicine, and then compare it, or maybe the other way around, using iodine-131, you know, that is after 1950s, when radioiodine was introduced to Taiwan, using radioiodine to study thyroid physiology during the Cold War. Okay, so before I start, let me just give you some very quick background information. Three things. One is about Taiwan, and one is about thyroid diseases, and then one is nuclear medicine. Okay, now Taiwan was colonized by Japan in the period between 1895 and 1945. And after World War II, it became dominated by the US, and I would say even today. Before the introduction of iodine-131, goiter and hypothyroidism was treated surgically, mostly by doing thyroidectomy. And this would explain why we will encounter surgeons in my presentation. Most of them were surgeons. And nuclear medicine is defined as the application of isotopes in diagnosis, treatment, and research of diseases and conditions. In this case, it's the use of isotopes to treat or diagnose and study thyroid. That is the domain of nuclear medicine. Okay, now let me introduce my historical actors. Some of them are, I would say, local actors. They're doing transnational exchanges. And I analyzed the activities of the early users of isotopes in Taiwan, including Dr. Gao Tiancheng, that would be Tiancheng Gao, and Wang Guangzhu, Guangzhu Wang, whose careers span the colonial and post-war periods. So these are the people I'm very interested because they lived through both era, and they are right in the transition of this period. So now this is Dr. Gao Tiancheng, who died in 1964, and he was a surgeon. He was educated in Japan. He was a Taiwan-born physician, and he starting from 1948, he was in charge of the surgical department of the NTU hospital. And in the period between 1953 and 64, he was the superintendent of NTU hospital. Now, this is a very important position in that time period because he was one of the elite, medical elite who would be receiving a lot of, who would be doing and receiving a lot of research and information mostly from the US. And he was one of the 2 medical experts in the Taiwan delegation to the second conference of the peaceful use of atomic energy in 1958. And this is Dr. Wang Guangzhu. He was actually a radiologist. He was not a surgeon at NTU Hospital, who was also educated in Japan, and he received training at Oak Ridge after World War II. This is the time when there was lots of technical exchanges between Taiwan and the US. So he received a grant and then went to Oak Ridge to be trained in nuclear medicine. And this is another actor who is an American, Marshall Brucer. He's one of the pioneers of nuclear medicine, also the chairman of medical division of the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies, what is called ORINS. And you could see in this picture, apparently was taken when he was visiting Taiwan. And the banner in the back, it says, translated as Atomic Authority. And this was actually presented by Dr. Gao, the man we just encountered. And so let me just do a quick comparison between these two groups. The one on the left is Marshall Brucer, and he was promoting isotopes around the world. And this is sort of part of the globalization of isotopes that was promoted by the US AEC. And he was also inventing methods and devices for doing nuclear medicine. And he was very interested in standardization. And he also has a very strong sense of scientific internationalism, which is, he likes to promote what his method and his research. And on the hand side is Dr. Gao and Wang. And they are the users, or you say the kind of a local application of the use of isotopes as a continuation of, actually they think as colonial research of goiter. And they apply Marshall Brucer's materials and methods. And the background of they were so eager and interested in doing this is it was part of the nation building of Taiwan during the Cold War time. Okay, now let's take a look at the colonial medicine of this study. And there are 2 things that I need to say is goiter was the surgeon's territory. You might find this interesting, especially if you understand goiter from contemporary time. But actually, as I said earlier, it was treated mostly by surgeons using surgery. And one of the interesting things that the colonial study of goiter was that it was a field that uses a lot of different research methods, and it concerns geographical, ethnic, and environmental characteristics of the condition of the diseases. And this is a picture done by Dr. Kawaishi, who is a Japanese doctor who was in Taiwan at the Imperial Taipei University, 1939. And you could see from the pictures, he has all these different interests, including geographical locations and ethnic differences. And so they were also interested in Aborigines and how the goiter condition was among this group of people. And so this is just a summarize of all the papers that published in the Journal of Formosa Medical Association, JFMA, in the period between 1902 and 1945. And there are a total of 112 articles speeches and reports on thyroid diseases, particularly goiter. And there's a diverse coverage in terms of research method, questions, and scope. So they were using surveys and statistics and all that. And this is on the right-hand side. This Dr. Gao and Kawaishi. So they were actually sort of mentor and students in their relationship. Actually, their relationship continued after World War II, when Kawaishi had returned to Japan. And Kawaishi is actually from Hiroshima. And the funny part is that after he returned to Hiroshima, he started using isotopes to study goiter too. So there's kind of interesting change of story, and yet there are some continuities. So that again, Dr. Gao presented this banner. It says a leading authority in surgery to his teacher Kawaishi. This was 1954. Okay, so to summarize what happened during colonial period in terms of study on thyroid is there's this imperial governance of the thyroid. The studies on thyroid disorders in the context of colonial medicine, mostly goiter, was situated in the geographical, racial, and environmental concerns, mostly of surgeons based in two surgical departments of the Imperial University of Taipei, that is the leading university during colonial time. Okay, so now let's turn into the Cold War science. So there's this kind of globalization of isotopes that was going on, and especially the introduction of iodine-131. And just to give a quick background, and this is actually a picture, a comic taken from Angela Krieger's book, Life Atomic, A History of Radioisotope in Science and Medicine, published in 2013. So it shows this AEC person, he was trotting around the globe to promote radioisotopes. And it's kind of interesting photo. And this is a picture taken in 1957 when a group of AEC US experts arriving in Taiwan. And quickly you could see what they were doing. They were doing all kinds of infrastructure for this kind of isotopes application to be possible. And this is a groundbreaking ceremony. Was soon after they arrived. This was taken June 12th, actually. And the man in the middle with this, I don't know how that's Marshall Bruce. And there's this group of people, including president of NTU and also president of National Tsinghua University. And also Gao Tianchen is the one in the glass in the back, right behind Marshall Bruce. Okay, soon after that, Gao Tianchen, Dr. Gao was interested in promoting this isotopes, and he published a very lengthy paper published in JFMA. And in this paper, his point was, there was this sense of trying to catch up with the world. So it's a comprehensively introduced medical isotopes and carefully evaluating their potential and advantages. The application of isotopes were broad, including diagnosis, treatment, physiological studies, and so on, and also the economic side of it. And one of the things was very interesting was that isotopes were apparently much cheaper, according to Dr. Gao, compared to radium. And this is a picture about using dog as experimental animal to do iodine intake research, 1962. Okay, now I think one side of globalization is standardization, because if without standardization, it's almost impossible to compare. So this is a problem that globalization encountered. And here's a quote from Marshall Bruce. It is difficult for a scientist in one part of the country to compare his results directly with the results of another scientist far away. The instrumentation used was new to most physicians, and frequently it was strange. So there was all this kind of a data issue, discrepancies and all that. And this was 1957. It was actually a part of a report by Marshall Bruce when he was going around in Asia. And the funny part is that Dr. Wang and also published around the same time, soon after Marshall Bruce's visit. He applied Marshall Bruce's method in this paper to study thyroid uptake. And he also compared in this paper data from Boston, Mendoza, and Hsinchu. I don't have time to go into the Mendoza research, but it was a very famous case in early 1950s. And Dr. Dr. Wang in this paper also connect colonial medicine and Cold War studies in this paper. Okay, I probably don't have time to go into Marshall Bruce's research, but in Dr. Wang's paper, he mentioned that he decided to use Marshall Bruce's method because that's a way to sort of solve the issue of method standardization. And this is in the paper, there's this diagram that it's interesting to see. The normal curve is data from Boston, and the shaded part is data from Mendoza. And the other, the square ones are data from Taiwan. And so it's a way to sort of synchronize with the global research, okay? But the funny part is he didn't break away from the colonial medicine. He actually, in his reference, you could see traces of studies from previous colonial time. Okay. And Dr. Gao's paper actually was translated into English and then presented in the second conference for peaceful uses of atomic energy. And the funny part is in Taiwan, there's a newspaper report about this and how he was noticed and he was getting a lot of attention from international community. I doubt it. And he said, catching great attention at the conference, and medical scientists from several European countries and United States have invited Gao to visit their facilities for further exchanges in scientific experiments. So in other words, on the local side, he was seen as presenting Taiwan and was very successful. And, Taiwan became sort of the attention. Okay. I would skip this part because it's very similar what happened, this knowledge production, this kind of global and local in this. And Taiwan also participated in the IAEA's calibration and standardization in 1960, even though actually I noticed some countries that were not really interested in this, but Taiwan was very interested. And so here's where Taiwan is. Okay. And now I will just go to the conclusion because I'm running out of time, I'm sorry. Studies of the thyroid during colonial time were situated in the Japanese Empire, which was concerned with geographical, environmental, and ethnic differences. Cold War era iodine-131 studies focused on the physiology of the thyroid organ and standardization of measurement as a key to globalization. While Dr. Gao saw the study of thyroid disorder in post-World War II nuclear medicine as the continuation of colonial medicine, the two are significantly different in the ways knowledge was produced. Physician scientists in Taiwan participated in the globalization of the isotope as a part of the nation building during Cold War. Even though iodine-131 was used to treat hyperthyroidism in 1957, clinical practice on the ground vis-a-vis patients saw some fundamental continuities with the colonial past. Surgery remained the common treatment method for a long time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't think it takes lots of imagination to think things together because there are many points of convergences, I think, and there will probably be even more across the different talks.
We have time for one question while we transition to our next speaker who is online.
Or we can discuss everything at the end as you prefer.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. So Clay, can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I can hear you. Good morning.
For some reason, I will have to put the sound off so that it comes out from the not from my computer, basically. So audio.
Okay, do you mind if I try to share my screen just to
Yeah,
make
go
sure
for it. Go for it. Sorry. Yeah, I don't see that I can change. Ah, yeah, here I go. Can you try and speak again?
Hi, can you hear me?
Ah, perfect. That's a lot better.
Great.
So can you share your screen now?
Yes, I will just try to get into presenter view really fast.
Yeah. And I will turn the computer on the other side so you can see the room a little bit.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, if I'm doing this, it should work. And now you should be able to see human beings or something that looks like that.
So we are all AIs.
Yeah, we're all AIs. This is the Truman Show, actually. So we now have a presentation by Clay Davis from Northwestern University on meta-analysis as a tool for the global circulation, uncertainty, and expertise. Thank you very much, Clay. You can now share your screen, maybe?
Thank you. Yes, I'm just looking to see how I can get it into presenter mode. I'm not sure how to do that actually.
Maybe I need to grant you something. No.
Um,
So you need to find the green.
I think I might have.
You're okay? You want us to call some tech people?
No, thank you. I have it on my screen right now, but I can't get back to Zoom for some reason.
I think you should go on the Zoom app and share and then go back to your PowerPoint.
Okay, good idea. Here, Zoom. I'll
And
share. This is what it looks like for me now. So I don't mind if you look at it this way,
Yeah,
but then
perfect.
all my notes and everything.
Yeah, we don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so this presentation is going to be a portrait of a method, and that method is called meta-analysis. And my argument is going to be in this presentation that, like many of the other objects of research that the other presenters have discussed, this method facilitates novel forms of global collaboration, and that it's worth looking closely at the method itself to describe what kinds of collaborations that it does facilitate. So just first briefly to describe what meta-analysis is. Meta-analysis is a statistical tool used to combine the results of several studies into a single persuasive systematic review. Meta-analysts choose studies and weight their results based on pre-specified criteria. For example, randomized clinical trials, when they're included in a meta-analysis, will count more than longitudinal studies might. The archetypical meta-analytic image or diagram is what's called the forest plot, and it's pictured at the right of the slide here. It stacks the results of included studies one on top of the other so that researchers can easily see trends in the study's similarities. Meta-analysis seeks to resolve controversy among researchers and reach consensus, but in practice, it often creates more uncertainty than it resolves. So when multiple meta-analyses on the same topic are conducted, for example, they often differ in their findings. This was the case for meta-analyses in breast cancer research, which did not agree on the proper age at which to start mammogram screening, and was also the case for several high-profile meta-analyses that sought to find the relationship between time spent playing video games and violent behavior, which also came to contrasting conclusions and left policymakers confused. So essentially, this is a meta-level statistical instrument designed to combine the results of different studies. And in creating this combination, this synthesis, some important details about the study's context are lost in order for the researchers to be able to make very general conclusions. And the politics of the way that this plays out are very interesting. So To start with the organizational structure that facilitates meta-analysis, there are several organizations like Cochrane and the Campbell Collaboration that are dedicated to commissioning meta-analyses, and others like the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, which promote the method while also funding primary research. These organizations have become major players in global health, in education policy, and healthcare, which pertain to the examples that I'll get to in a minute. So far, STS scholars have pointed out that meta-analysis is a new tool to enforce objectivity in Daston's sense of the term, meaning that it constrains individual judgment and disciplines a certain type of scientific self. This could apply, the idea of objectivity could apply to meta-analysis at several points in the method's life cycle. So first, organizations like Cochrane, which I just introduced, have published explicit guidelines on how to conduct meta-analyses. If followed, these procedures prevent meta-analysts' own bias from encroaching on the selection of studies, and therefore are said to guarantee an objective result from the standpoint of the analyst. So meta-analysis acts as sort of a scaffolding to prevent, to introduce a neutral third party to allow these studies to be put in comparison, to be weighted, to be evaluated. So it acts as a way of creating consensus through arbitration in that way, or it is said to. Second, meta-analysis, and this is the argument of Fries and Peterson in 2018, prevents individual instances of fraud and p-hacking from swaying its conclusions. And thus it not only disciplines individuals like the meta-analyst him or herself, but disciplines entire academic fields. These authors suggest that if Daston's mechanical objectivity placed constraints, like I was just saying, on individual researchers, meta-analysis is one component of a broader, quote, statistical objectivity that surveils entire fields, in their case, social psychology, by policing suspicious outliers. So in other words, by having this panoptic view of entire literatures, meta-analysis employs disciplinary constraints on entire groups of people, like social psychologists who have had many high-profile instances of fraud. And finally, meta-analysis imposes a third kind of objectivity, and that is on policymakers and other decision makers when their actions are constrained by mandates to do what works. And what works is often defined fairly narrowly as what can be proven by a meta-analysis. So meta-analysis, like risk analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis before it, is used to shield policymakers from skeptical publics by making their decisions appear evidence-based and methodical. Another key feature of meta-analysis, and this pertains more specifically to the topic of our conversation today, is its ability to extract data from the locales in which they are generated to make them docile. And this is an argument that Morera introduced in 2007. This means that data once bound to a given milieu becomes detached and ready for use for new purposes. I want to move away from this idea of meta-analysis as enforcing a negative ideal of objectivity to instead argue that meta-analysis is a tool used to garner consensus on certain terms and to amalgamate smaller studies rather than to suppress researcher discretion. And the way that I'm going to justify this shift in our understanding of meta-analysis is by tracing the method to its emergence in two fields, in psychology and in medicine. So the method emerged in these two fields simultaneously. In social psychology, meta-analysis served to resolve a heated dispute over the efficacy of psychotherapy. Glass, who coined the term meta-analysis in 1976, synthesized research in his field not to weed out fraudulent research, as Peterson and Fries identify meta-analysis as functioning today, but to determine if psychotherapy could withstand critical scrutiny. His innovation was to standardize effect sizes across disparate measures so that individual studies could come together and speak with one unanimous voice. This means of garnering consensus left an imprint on the method that continues to influence its use. And so this is an important detail, and if you'll indulge me, I'll return to my first slide here, which shows a cutoff picture, but it shows on the x-axis different normal curves. Each normal curve represents one study, and that study and all the others are placed on this x-axis using a metric that's called standardized mean difference. Now you can imagine that each one of these studies measured a different outcome variable, but the researchers translate each of those outcome variables to essentially how different the treatment group is from the control group across whatever it's being measured. And so this is a measure of standardized mean difference. And it allows studies that, for example, might measure the efficacy of psychotherapy on someone's subjective feeling of happiness, and the effect of psychotherapy on someone's, number of visits to a psychiatric provider. Now, I've made up both of those outcome measures, but the point is that Glass, with his innovation, would be able to compare them both and say that psychotherapy improved both measures by a standardized mean difference, or a standard effect size of 0.5, right? So there's a homogenization that happens across studies, and that was introduced in social psychology, or actually really just psychology more broadly. In medicine, where meta-analysis, and this has been shown in other work, emerged independently, the goal was to amalgamate smaller studies so that together they could have a bigger impact on actual practice of physicians. So it emerged in particular when Lau and Chalmers felt that individual randomized controlled trials of streptomycin to treat heart disease were falling on deaf ears, meaning that while the results of trials individually were not jarring enough to push physicians to adopt new protocols, when combined, their statistical significance became visible. So Chalmers wrote later that without meta-analysis, it would have taken far more RCTs before a life-saving intervention was widely recognized as such. In both of these cases, meta-analysis was independently proposed as a solution to a particular organizational and professional problem. Social psychologists were in need of a tool to build consensus and resolve conflict, and physicians were in need of a tool that could alert them to trends in the results of small trials that had become popular in teaching hospitals around the country. This point stands apart from the concern for objectivity that I was speaking of before, and that it doesn't see meta-analysis as responding to a particular moral problem, as objectivity is said to do to discipline researchers, but it instead responds to and gives researchers a tool to resolve organizational problems. So my intervention is to see meta-analysis as a boundary object with agency. And from an STS perspective, this is a term coined by Fleischman in 2006 to describe artifacts, instruments, or tools that facilitate exchanges between domains. So meta-analysis is a boundary object because it sits between multiple tools, and it sits between multiple fields, and in each field, it is recognized as having a similar function, but can be adapted on a case-by-case basis to their individual needs. So I'm going to briefly study the way meta-analysis and these two epistemic features have traveled beyond medicine into new cases. The first is a specific controversy in global health called the worm wars. And the second, and in the worm wars, the concern is the way that meta-analysis is deployed to reconcile a controversy about the allocation of scarce resources. And in the second, I'm going to be talking about surgical practice, in which meta-analysis is used to create global guidelines by amalgamating small place specific studies. And the questions that broadly animate my research are, for example, how do actors adapt their practices to the constraints imposed by meta-analysis? How do actors, or how does meta-analysis cause conflict or create consensus? What forms of objectivity does meta-analysis offer, and what are its consequences across domains? And I am specifically here paying attention to sort of the agency of the epistemic tool itself, and the way that its invention has left an imprint on its use today that might not be what any of the individuals who use it have chosen, but nonetheless remains an important sort of inertia that they have to deal with in using the tool. So to make this a little more concrete, let's look at the worm wars. So the worm wars happened recently, about 13 years ago, and in many ways they're ongoing. But the context of the worm wars is that at the turn of the 20th century, mass deworming was an intervention that was regarded as a magic bullet in the international development community. So mass deworming is the prophylactic administration of anti-helminth drugs, meaning that entire communities of school children, for example, are given by international aid organizations drugs like albendazole, which can treat worms, intestinal parasites in particular. And children are given these drugs even if they don't have the worms. So you can imagine that there are, it can be expensive, but it's not really that expensive because the drugs are cheap. But the size of the intervention is very massive. So it's important to determine whether or not it's effective on different levels before implementing it. But the intervention was largely supported by the group that Donovan calls randomistas. They get their name from their vociferous support of randomized controlled trials and development. They're researchers, mostly economists, whose method is suited to small development interventions. And mass deworming, despite its name, takes place at the school level rather than at the large scale level of infrastructure projects like bridges and dams, which characterized earlier forms of development. So deworming was very amenable to the method of the randomized control trial, and the randomized control trial, by and large, validated this intervention. So a dozen RCTs and longitudinal studies demonstrated the efficacy of mass deworming. Its efficacy was actually especially pronounced in the US South, where the Rockefeller Foundation had eradicated hookworm, and in Korea, where local actors had similar success. One study stood out as a standout advocate of mass deworming. This was Kramer and Miguel's so-called Kenya study, which found that mass deworming had downstream impacts on school attendance, even of the students who weren't treated. So it had spillover effects in communities beyond those who were even treated with the drug. And pictured here is a deworming intervention that took place outside of Hanoi in Vietnam. And just as a brief interlude here, this emphasis on randomized control trials to determine what interventions work in global health, it was sort of part of a broader concern about the allocation of scarce resources at this time, and it reached many public audiences. So here's Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times saying, quote, "How can we most effectively break cycles of poverty? For decades, we had answers that were mostly anecdotal or hot air, but increasingly we are now seeing economists provide answers that are rigorously field tested, akin to the way drugs are tested in randomized controlled trials." And Kristof goes on to identify mass deworming as the specific intervention that has been lauded by randomized controlled trials as highly efficacious and a very good value for money. And the reason this is an interesting episode for me is because in a few years, a meta-analysis turned all of this on its head. So when a meta-analysis confronted this literature, it came to a completely different conclusion. In 2007, a Cochrane meta-analysis and later similar meta-analyses by the Lancet and the Campbell collaboration challenged key findings of Miguel Kramer's RCT in Kenya and other RCTs of mass deworming interventions. They did so on the grounds that only certain kinds of studies could be included in the meta-analysis. Miguel and Kramer's was eliminated on the ground that a follow-up period was phased so that effects of the intervention may have crept into the control group. So it was eliminated on methodological grounds. They were saying that in essence couldn't be reconciled with other similar randomized trials of deworming and wasn't amenable to the meta-analytic method. And these criteria imposed on the RCTs and which excluded Miguel and Kramer's were reminiscent of the tools used in psychology, where meta-analysis honed in on individual metrics so that disparate studies could be commensurate. However, in the case of deworming, meta-analysis played the role of mediator not merely across different measurements of psychotherapy, but of different values in global health. In other words, some RCTs measured school attendance like Miguel Kramer's and raised the question, should school attendance be valued as highly as increases in body weight? The answer to a policymaker might depend on their values or the preferences of their constituency, but to meta-analysts, the choice is preordained by methodological constraints. So without taking too much of my time and going into the details of the reasons that meta-analysts at Cochrane provided for rejecting the Miguel and Kramer study, the interesting thing here is a complete pivot in what our randomistas, as Donovan calls them, regarded to be a very effective intervention, and what meta-analysts now, using new methodological tools, have sort of cast as outdated. And my argument here is that the tool meta-analysis has, through inherited ideas from psychology, changed the way that we talk about, or that different actors can discuss in a new forum, the effectiveness of global health interventions. And outside of this case of the worm wars, the use of meta-analysis to address issues in global health has several other problems which have been identified by people other than me. So, for example, McMichael et al. Said, gains in developing country public health are unlikely to emerge from systematic reviews alone, but will require decisions about intersectoral collaboration and social policy initiatives. So, similar to RCTs, meta-analyses have pretty narrow lenses, and they're not able to measure these kinds of intersectoral collaborations. And we might miss a very important reform or governance policy that's likely to help many people, and because meta-analysis simply doesn't have the epistemic capacity to test it. That's a similar argument, a very familiar argument to many. The second is about the amount of data that's available in different places. So Tomlinson says, in the Cochrane review titled Systemic Corticosteroids for the Treatment of COVID-19, 4 out of the 10 studies that contributed to the analysis were conducted in high-income countries. In the review discussion, the authors emphasized the potential lack of applicability of the results to lower resource settings. In India, trials indicate that rates of mucormycosis, or black fungus, have increased rapidly, which may be related to the impact of corticosteroids on immunity and the risk of subsequent infection. So they're essentially saying that trials that took place in London may not be relevant to interventions in COVID-19 in India, where black fungus plays a serious role and might prevent a physician from prescribing corticosteroids. And this is an important question about to what extent information from different places can be homogenized in a method like meta-analysis. And it raises the concern that if meta-analysis plays a larger and larger role in determining what kinds of interventions we choose, we may miss important differences in local context. So in my second case,
Hi, Clay. I don't know if you see the chat, but you need to conclude. I'm so sorry. We need to have equal time for all speakers.
oh, okay. Yes, 3 minutes. Got it. Oh, no. Okay, now I will skip my case, and then I will just say, this, if anyone has questions, they can look at this slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Clay. Sorry for being for asking you.
No, you're totally fine. I'm sorry about my technical problems. Thank you for putting up with it.
No, sorry. It's all the tech. You can't do everything and see everything at once, but it's so important to think meta-analysis is an object of STS. So I'm sure we'll have lots of discussions at the end of the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you able to unshare your screen by any chance?
Yeah.
Thanks. So for technical reasons, we'll stay online with Laure Manache, and then we'll have Jennifer at the very end. So we'll have in person at the end of the session as well. So Laure, you can share your screen and I'll introduce you in the meantime. So Laure is a PhD student at the CNRS at the Centre Alexandre Coiré, which is a Center for History and Social Studies of Science in Paris, at the same School for Advanced Studies for Social Sciences. And her talk today is going to be constructing global soil carbon stocks, the making of climate relevant knowledge using soil monitoring networks. And Laure, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Following Ellie, I'm going to talk about soils. I'm a PhD student at the CNRS, as Ellie said, and I work on the transformations of soil science and knowledge in the face of climate change. And I work particularly on the promises associated with soil carbon sequestration. So soils are one of the largest reservoirs of carbon on Earth, holding 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. Additionally, the possibility of sequestering carbon in soils has gained attention in recent years. So the idea is to increase the amount of carbon in soils in order to absorb excess CO2 from the atmosphere. So soil carbon sequestration was highlighted with programs and policies such as the 4 per thousand initiative, which was launched at the COP21 in 2015 in Paris, presenting soils as a promise in the fight against climate change. So in this perspective, soils are more and more considered for their role in climate change and are increasingly viewed as a global stock of underground carbon that needs to be measured, monitored, mapped, and modeled. So since the turn of the 2000s, soil carbon stocks are included in environmental monitoring systems to quantify them and understand their evolution in order to produce climate-relevant knowledge. So I draw from an in-depth qualitative investigation of two monitoring networks. So the French Réseau de mesure de la qualité des sols, or RMQS, which is focused on soils, and the European Integrated Carbon Observation System, ICOS, which is focused on climate change and the carbon cycle. So despite being rooted in two different scientific communities, so soil science and climate science, both networks have come to include a measure of soil carbon stocks. So my investigation is based on 12 interviews with scientists, engineers, policymakers, 5 field observations, including the visits of ICOS stations, and gray literature and scientific papers as well. So by comparing the inclusion of soils in a climate monitoring system and the inclusion of climate in a soil monitoring system, I wish to understand how these knowledge infrastructures negotiate and account for the complex relationship between climate and soils. So the tension between a universal claim and the localized production of knowledge is particularly salient in the case of soil carbon, which is highly heterogeneous and variable depending on location, as it is mobilized to understand global climate change. So the SCS literature on infrastructure studies and environmental surveillance studies has highlighted the role of these infrastructures in producing such a global knowledge on the planet and its state. And Edwards has identified two opposite movements, which are making global data and making data global. And I will here draw especially from making global data, delving into the instruments, practices, and knowledge that give soil global meanings. So I will first recount how climate and soil monitoring networks have come to include a measurement of soil carbon stocks, and then I will look at how soil carbon is given this global meaning, notably through two examples, so the design of sampling strategies and the building of the average soil sample. So first, the RMQS was created in 2000 and is coordinated by a research unit in France. It was born in the context of the development of environmental monitoring at the end of the 90s. It is rooted in the study of soil, and it carries out long-term monitoring of soil quality by coordinating sampling campaigns across the national territory. So its main objective is to provide data on the state of French soils, national references and trends by land use types in order to contribute to national policies on soils. So for example, through the data collected, InfoSoil produces national maps of different variables, including soil carbon stocks, which you can see on the slide. So it's the map that you can see here. Secondly, the European ICOS network was created in 2008 to monitor the atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems by tracking greenhouse gases and other variables enabling those fluxes to be interpreted. So its aim is to obtain comprehensive data covering all compartments that play a role in the carbon cycle, to establish a net balance of greenhouse gas fluxes, and to provide data for Earth system models. So the idea for the ICOS network arose as the issue of carbon in relation to climate change moved up the political agenda, notably through COP events. So it is strongly rooted in the climate community, and it is mostly run by atmospheric physicists. So the ICOS network is therefore not focused on soils at all, they are simply one of the ecosystem compartments that is monitored by the network. So the RMQS and ICOS have very different ways of functioning. So the RMQS is based on 2,000 non-instrumented sites throughout France, which are distributed on a 16 kilometer square grid, which you can see on the slide. It's the French map with all the little squares. And so soil sample measurement and observations are made within each grid. The analysis is mostly based on the physical and chemical properties of the soils. And to conduct the campaign, it is mostly done by a team of soil scientists. So it is really strongly rooted in soil science expertise. So the program costs around 1 million euros per year, which is financed by the French Ministries of Agriculture and Environment, and it's not a lot of money for such a big program. Unlike the RMQS, the ICOS network is based on stations that are permanently instrumented, notably with a flux tower, to measure CO2 in real time. Many variables are also measured, including nitrogen and methane fluxes. So you can see the map of all the stations across the European territory. All the stations are connected to a semantic center, which manages the network of station and design protocols. ICOS is partly funded by the European Union and partly by member states through contribution from national ministries. This type of monitoring is both costly and time-consuming because several million euros per site must be invested to set up and maintain the infrastructure. So both the RMQS and ICOS have come to measure soil carbon stocks. So the first RMQS campaign in 2000 included an assessment of those stocks because it was deemed a priority for the network in line with the emergence of this issue during the Kyoto Protocol. So the goal was to provide national estimates and trends for these stocks. And so today, there is a calculation for the stocks every 15 years. So for the RMQS, climate change and the role of soils in this process has been a justification since the start to put in place such a network, and it is considered by many in the soil science community as a leverage to gain legitimacy and funding for the network. So for ICOS, soil carbon stocks have also been included since the beginning. And the aim was slightly different because it was to be able to interpret soil carbon stocks in the light of the many variables that are also measured by the stations. And in order to get this quality information, a lot of stock measures at different depths are carried out every 8 years around the station. But for scientists that are mostly focused on climate, soil monitoring proved to be full of constraint and far removed from their interest, even if most of them agree that it's an important component of the carbon cycle. So as one of those scientists said, soil monitoring is a very thankless job of no interest to anyone, but it's super important at the same time. Soil carbon stocks are more important than in the biomass. What's going to happen in soils, in the permafrost, etc., is important. But it's not like the Nord Stream smoke plume or volcano rain. It's not as spectacular, it doesn't sell as well, let's say. Underlining the challenge of putting this kind of monitoring into place in a community that's not focused on soils in the first place. So if both networks account for soil carbon stocks, they have different objectives. The RMQS produces data made to be extrapolated using statistical models to produce national estimates and trends, while ICOS produces data made to be finally analyzed. In both cases, soil carbon is abstracted from the local, either by being linked to the large scale, so maps at the national and global levels, as we've seen, or by being incorporated into general theories about the evolution of those stocks. So now we're going to delve more into the process of quantifying those soil carbon stocks. So it's a multi-stage process aiming at producing this climate-relevant soil knowledge at the scale of the French and European territory. So we will focus here on two steps of this process. So first, the design of standardized sampling strategies, and then the building of the average soil sample. So the first step is to establish a carefully designed standardized sampling strategy to obtain soil samples. So both in the case of the RMQS and ICOS, this step is conducted by statisticians to produce standardized and replicable protocol across locations and stations. So the crafting of sampling protocols draws from geostatistics, which is a discipline at the crossroad of mapping and statistics, whose goal is to make sense of continuous phenomena using discontinuous measures. So the sampling strategy depends on the aim of the network. With the RMQS, the number of sample location is very high, more than 2,000 points, since it covers the French metropolitan territory. Therefore, only a limited number of samples is taken at each location. So 25 soil samples are taken on a surface of 20 meters by 20 meters, selected according to the grid that you can see on the slide. So all the green dots are sampled at each location. In the case of ICOS, only 3 stations of the network provide data on their soil carbon stocks in France. So at this station, a high number of samples is taken. So in total, between 60 and 100 samples are taken on a surface like around the station. So as you can see on the slide, the area is divided into 10 sub-areas in which 2 random points are selected. And then around those random points, 5 different points are actually sampled, which are the yellow cross that you can see on the slide. So in both cases, statisticians are involved to define the best sampling protocol according to the final goal of this data. So statistics is the first tool used to account for soil carbon spatial variability. So one ICOS station manager recalls the power given to statistician viewpoint when it comes to crafting the correct protocol. So he said, you ask yourself very simple questions like, yes, soils have a high spatial variability, so we need to take this into account. So you go and find a statistician. In this case, we want a high precision because we want to be able to check every 10 years whether it has increased or decreased, and we want to have some confidence in this. The statistician says, given the average level of variability of soil carbon, we need a 1 meter core sample at 50 points. So in this case, the statistician's viewpoint ended up being the final protocol. And so this is, we can say that this is in a stark contrast with the traditional expertise on soil built up by pedology, which is the study, the discipline of the study of soils, because it was mostly based on field knowledge and personal, sensible experience of soils. Moreover, the protocols put up in place are statically strong enough in both cases to suit the final use of this data. Therefore, more than local data, the way these data on soils are collected reflects their final use. Now we're going to talk about the second step, which is the building of the average soil sample. So once the sampling protocols have been designed, the sampling campaigns can be put into place. So the sampling methods are labor-intensive, as numerous samples have to be collected at each site using a hand auger, which is a tool that you can see on the slide that you have to insert into the ground. It is also a complicated procedure, as the protocols are highly centralized and established by statisticians working away from the field, and they do not take into account all the local specificities and problems that station managers and campaigners might encounter in diverse locations. So once the samples have been collected, they must first be brought back to the lab to be prepared. So they are first dried and sieved, and then sophisticated preparation techniques are then used based on the concept of the composite sample. So the aim is to cope with the spatial variability of soil carbon. So from several samples that are collected at each location and station, one or several super samples are constituted. And so I'm quoting the RMQS manual here. The principle of constituting a composite sample is to mix in equal parts the elementary samples of each soil layer taken from the sampling surface. So for the RMQS, one composite sample is constituted for the location, and for ICOS, 20 composite samples are constituted for one station. So the resulting super samples enable an initial averaging and reduction of the soil's spatial variability. Once this first step is done, the composite samples are prepared for analysis. So the aim is to produce a subsample which is constituted by taking out different portions of the composite sample while retaining its physico-chemical properties. So this stage is known as the composite sample reduction, as the composite sample is reduced from a few kilos to 650 grams of fine soil. So it is obtained by spreading the composite sample in several trays and taking out diagonally portions of soil in each tray. So as you can see on the slide, and then once you have taken out this different portion, you mix them all together. So at this stage, the samples are homogenized a second time, getting one step further from the initial raw samples. So what we can see in the end is that the original 25 or 101 meter deep samples containing rocks and roots and weighing several kilos are reduced to a few bags containing 650 grams of fine soils. So this process allows for a drastic reduction of soil complexity while retaining most of the physico-chemical properties or information that researchers are interested in. So once all of this is done, so once the samples have been collected, dry, mixed twice, and reduced, the samples are delivered from all over France and Europe by carrier to the soil analysis laboratory, which is in northern France. Carbon content is quantified using the dry combustion method, where the subsample is heated and the gases released are measured. And then this value is transmitted for registration in the database of the RMQS and ICOS. So in this sense, we can say that the samples are mobilized from the field to the lab and are the object of a cascade of ever simplified inscriptions that allow harder facts to be produced, as Latour would put it. So what we can say about this is that using sampling protocols based on geostatistics and sampling analysis methods carried out through average soil spatial diversity at a given site, both RMQS and ICOS are able to produce data on soil carbon that are meant to say something meaningful about soils at a large and universal scale. So in this sense, the RMQS provide broad territorial coverage to observe trend and developments once the data have been compiled. As for ICOS, the data are used to understand and manage global climate change, and in particular, soil carbon stocks data are produced to understand the universal drivers of this carbon compartment. So what appears from the data produced by these two networks is that local data about soil carbon stocks are not progressively made global and universal by a series of translation from their site of production to the big scales, but rather are produced locally in a way that makes them fit for the global and the universal. And as a corollary to this focus on the big and universal scale in both networks, there seems to be an absence of the local. For the RMQS, interpreting site-by-site measurements is complicated because accuracy is not high enough. As for ICOS, soils are only one compartment of a much bigger system and are not the focus of the attention. So it's not really that there's an erasure of the local, but more is that the local never seemed to be an objective of both networks, so it is more like an absence. And what I can say as a conclusion is that it can be noted that the RMQS and ICOS, despite being very different, they use similar procedures to deal with the great heterogeneity of soil carbon. So they use centralized network management, highly standardized protocols. They also implement sophisticated sampling strategies. They create this average or composite sample. And lastly, they have a high degree of centralization of analysis, with this being carried out in a single laboratory in France. So the data produced enable us to obtain an overview of soil carbon stocks, which are symbolized by the many national and global maps produced, which help refine Earth system models, which are used for the IPCC, and our understanding of the global carbon cycle needed to manage climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laure. I think we'll switch to Jennifer right away, and then we'll have time for so after Jennifer there is a time for a coffee break. Normally, if you're happy to stay a few more minutes, then we have just a bit of time to sacrifice coffee for intellectual discussion. So thank you, Laure. If you can unshare your screen.
Yes.
And I'll share Jen's presentation on the screen. And so Jennifer Crasson from the University of Arizona is talking to us today about growing convergence research, articulating the specificity of a hybrid experimental platform. And then you're also leading the discussion afterwards, sharing everything. So the floor is yours as soon as I manage to share the screen. Here we are. Can you see the screen online? Can you hear us online?
Yes, yes, we can see the screen.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for your forbearance with our technical problems and timing issues. So this is such a nice setup because we've been talking about dirt and statistics and the biosphere, and that is the site of this field work. So based on 2 years of patchwork ethnography, this presentation is an examination of the articulations across disciplines, scale, and other sites of a medium scale research platform. Prior to this study, a decade of intensive hydrogeochemical study of this site, they're now trying to add plants, and I will sort of talk us through us. I will give us a brief introduction, talk about context, observations, and some brief conclusions. So we've seen a little bit of the biosphere, which is about 45 minutes north of the University of Arizona. It has a long, storied, and somewhat weird history as a research facility and site. I am an embedded social scientist with the LEO platform. This is a view of it. The LEO site would have been the farm for the biosphere had it not fallen apart. LEO is, and I'll show some of the inner workings, has been primarily concerned with primary succession in soil, and for the last decade has been used by what I will call the hydrology mafia, have sort of dominated research on this, and they're trying to answer the questions about soil formation. So I'll very briefly talk about literatures, key terms, methods, the sites, and the institutions. In terms of the literature, I'm integrating some of Latour's work about circulations and references and how they are made to circulate, how words and measures are made to connect to pieces of the material world, and to disrupt. This is not merely rhetorical work. This is also material work that my scientists are conducting. And this is also tied, however, to Sharon Terweek's work about instruments such as CERN or SLAC or large scale instruments, because LEO is fairly large. For example, I want to talk about how this instrument shapes careers and has some interesting time constraints that are working around it. So LEO again is roughly the size of a either American or international football field, composed of 3 different bays, which are about the size of a conventional tennis court. The size and the scale of it suggest a research platform. However, that language is used in information systems. So it's a little hard to use the word platform without all of a sudden connotating all the things about social media platforms and platforming and deplatforming. So I'm using a hybrid experimental system to reflect the multiple levels of integrated instrumentation. I am tasked in this project with studying and facilitating interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm not going to talk too much about that here, but it is relevant to the research design problems for managing the hybrid experimental system. I'm interested in this question about articulations, and I just have to generate about the way things mesh together from different registers and domains. The point of which representations come to work as boundary objects between objects and processes. Not the focus here, but this also opens up a whole bunch of questions about interdisciplinarity, whether it's the property of a person or the property of a team, and what kinds of expertise are needed to negotiate that. And then finally, what I'm very interested in is about the question of path dependency, because when you have a giant platform like Leo, a decision you make, you will live with for a decade, if not for the life of the entire project. So I have done this as patchwork ethnography because traditional immersive fieldwork is impossible for all sorts of things, and it blurs the boundary in the process between observational phase and writing it up. So this is still an ongoing presentation. I might change my mind about some things next year, depending on what they get up to. This component of explicitly engaging a social scientist to facilitate and observe convergence has often been unclear as to the boundary between observing and intervening. Like, I can see when people are not converging, and that is anthropologically interesting to me, but not necessarily in the best interests of my interlocutors to let that disjuncture or conflict continue. So I have to sort of get over my personal concern and like intervene in ways that are not strictly anthropological observation. It is definitely not clear that the social science component has been entirely welcome. We won't go into those stories. So Leo is embedded in Biosphere 2. It is one of the major components. It would have been the farm for the Biosphere had it continued. The Biosphere 2 is, after a very complicated and expensive trajectory, like $20 million purchase, embedded in the University of Arizona, having been abandoned by Columbia. It is a convergence and interdisciplinary, and it's considered like a growth platform. Let me say a little bit more here. The structure of Leo is basalt, and it is meant as a basalt hill slope. It is made to be analogic to other basalt hill slopes, to brownfields, which are places with high environmental degradation, and it is explicitly engages ecotron and other research greenhouse facilities. So this is one of the 3 bays, right? There are 500 metric tons, a million pounds of basalt. This, and Eli had a picture of this also. This is underneath it. So you're at this point standing under a third of a million pounds of basalt standing underneath it. It's a little uncanny because it's has a solidity to it that you experience. There are many tons of basalt overhead. There are 1,800 hydrologic sensors, which are dropping out as the system ages. It's now a decade old, and so sensor coverage is becoming more sparse, and it's interesting to watch them negotiate the validity of their work with that dropout. At the bottommost end of these hill slopes on a 10% grade are collection areas where water, sometimes seeded with isotopes, is collected for experiments. Again, the hydrologists have basically run this facility for 10 years. The 3 bays, and they were designed with these 3 bays, were designed to be replicates, but they no longer are. As east, center, and west have diverged, incipient air currents have led to different crust, slope, and vegetation patterns as air has seeped in and dropped spores and bacteria on the facility. Even at its origins, there were subtle hydrogeological differences between the slopes. There's a lot of articulation work that now has to be done to either emphasize or de-emphasize, depending on the audience, these diversions, right? So sometimes they want to say Leo is one thing, and sometimes they're making most of these internal distinctions that have emerged. As a basalt hill slope, it is nearest to the new soils produced by volcanic action, such as Kilauea. I don't have time to go see it, or the volcanoes in the Azores. I keep telling the PI, we need a field trip. We need to go to the Azores as a team, all 30 of us. Not happening. The materials were collected from the Flagstaff basalt deposits from the Sunset Crater, which was erupted in 1085 Common Era, so almost 1,000 years ago. Even this material needs both physical and rhetorical intervention to work, to be rendered inert. Right, so this has spent a decade basically trying to figure out how basalt becomes a platform for actual plant growth. The materials from Flagstaff are sufficiently abiotic as to not matter, but they're not actually purely sterilized. However, the basalt that ends up in the greenhouses, such as Ecotron, ends up becoming actually sterilized in autoclaves. Soil collection techniques are designed to minimize impacts, but nonetheless represent one register of path dependency, which disrupts simple narratives of replication. So I think you might remember the picture of the gantry. People hang above Leo and don't touch it, except for to collect petri dishes, what they call their hamburgers of soil, to be minimally invasive soil samples. And similarly, only periodically and very carefully and with very good reason do they do in-depth soil samples. The bays are 1 meter deep of basalt. It's just a lot of dirt overhead if you're in there. So Leo has a moss problem. To quote Jurassic Park, life finds a way. No one has seeded it with moss, but again, the moss spores and cyanobacteria and all of that kind of stuff has come in through the vents. And so the West has far more greenery than the East, which is the distribution patterns. All right, let's move up one level to the institutions. Again, this is meant to be a project facilitating interdisciplinary convergence as they're intentionally adding life on Leo. They've included botanists, people interested in metabolomics, genomicists, community ecologists, mycologists, and microbiologists. Plus, I almost forgot, there's a whole generation of modelers on the statistical side that have been tracking Leo for about a decade. It also fits in with the complexity of research parks as sites of university ventures. Biosphere 2 is, it's painted white. It's literally a white elephant that no one quite knows what to do with, but it has multi-million dollars of investment, so it represents sunk costs. So they're constantly trying to figure out how to pay for this thing, to keep it funded, and to keep public interest in it, so that people can tour public areas of the biosphere. Yeah, so I think when you were doing your field work, were part of the catering staff for a wedding at Biosphere, right? It still has this problem of like, what do we do with this very large space that has been built? One of the ways that Leo was designed and represents itself as a worthy experimental platform is its focus on the hill slope scale. For geologists and hydrologists, it is the critical scale between the lab and the greenhouse and the field or the landscape. Choosing the hill slope because of its specific relevance to hydrogeochemistry or biogeochemistry and modeling governed the hybrid experimental system for its first decade. So again, there's a lot of work establishing the sort of constraints of this particular physical object, football field size, as important to generating explanations and bridging scales. Again, this is I don't know whether you knew about this. One of the ongoing supporting experiments for establishing baseline and replicability comparisons for Leo involves the Ecotron closed greenhouse laboratories to examine highly controlled plant soil interactions. So establishing this meant, and he mentioned this, moving 500 kilograms of basalt from Leo via overseas shipping. It was literally months of email correspondence, identifying these samples. Do not call samples dirt or soil, because then you'll get wrapped up into international agricultural transport issues. So there's explicit emails. Hopefully I don't get anyone in trouble for this. Call them mineral samples. right? Because at this point, they're supposed to be just pure basalt. So it's not too much of a fib, but yeah, so sort of it's amusing, but it's just sort of track through all the levels of accommodation that need to happen to move a soil sample anywhere. Now, let me talk about the oops. And anyone has advice here, I'm happy to hear it, or examples or parallels. So we have been tooling along for 2.5 years. I have interviewed everyone, and we had a reverse site visit to reauthorize funding for another 2.5 years. And we didn't get it. Approximately 50% of the GCR convergence research groups don't get it, no matter how much great science you're doing. My interlocutors are a little unhappy. I was very worried that there was going to be sort of like throw the social scientists under the bus. We didn't demonstrate convergence, but in fact, it was a post hoc criticism of the plant species selected for implementation. Nobody saw that coming because it had been approved that we're going to put alfalfa on Leo. And then one of the panelists, we don't know which, said, we don't think that this is a great technical choice for implementing these experiments. So this was very disorienting. It was extremely, fortunately, we have a very good lead PI who had sort of held back some money because this came literally 2 weeks before the start of the new financial year, so that the postdocs 2 and graduate students 4 were going to be unfunded, like in it with a 2-week turnaround, which is like brutal. But he had held enough money in reserves that they are in fact covered for the year. So I'm trying to figure out now how to narrate this experience with Leo with this disruption, right? Because I had been constructing a narrative of success following their emerging publications and their new grants and positive interactions. And now I have to sort of, or try to reinterpret 2.5 years of work in the context of non-renewal. So I'm interested in other ethnographic experiences where post-fieldwork events suggest a gross reinterpretation of prior analysis. Like, well, what I thought was going on and is not what's going on. I continue to go to their weekly research group meetings because there are, again, so many for participants in different disciplines and international collaborators that it lives on Zoom still weekly. So I still attend those, and there are still recordings. I haven't quite figured out though what to do because I in fact have no formal role in this collaboration as funded. So I can only talk a little bit about it, but I think we can see here that Leo is extremely specific. It is well designed, it is large, but the specificity of the platform itself and the scale continually produces challenges to generalizability that my interlocutors are negotiating both materially, statistically, and rhetorically. The complexity of Leo, the hybrid experimental system, produces barriers to interdisciplinary convergence. I think there's something really important going on about path dependency, and there's actually very little literature written about path dependency in these infrastructural systems. Once they made the choice of alfalfa, they haven't actually put it on there yet, but it clearly shut several doors rather than opening several doors for future work. Now they're trying to figure out what's next because they want to put plants on Leo besides the volunteer mosses. Those choices are extremely important. They are non-reversible. I doubt they're ever going to take Leo back to bare basalt that's been sterilized, right? So I'm wondering if there are other parallels or how to think about these pathways that become defined. They're both constrained and enabled, basic technology studies insight by these infrastructural choices. And then the other thing I haven't quite figured out is the scaling of Leo. It's a platform. I actually prefer a platform to hybrid experimental system. It itself is composed of instruments. And then it speaks to other instrumental systems, and it demands that instruments like Ecotron travel to improve replicability and comparability. So this is a work in progress, but I'm really enthused by the different connections that we can make across all of our papers on these kinds of articulations between the local and the specific and the generalizable and the tools that we use to make those connections. Thank you.
So I'll turn the computer back, and we have as much time as you guys grant us. That we can also meet for lunch later at 12:30, but if you have some time for discussion, it'd be great. We can also meet for lunch, and just wanted to note that tomorrow at tomorrow at 3:40, there is Tim Corbalis in the room, who's also going to speak about Biosphere 2 in panel 296.
Actually, on Biosphere 2.
Oh.
Small material.
Okay, small material ecology systems. Oh yeah. Okay. So normally people in the Zoom should be able to see us, and we need to speak loud for them to hear us. But yeah, normally we should be able to have a hybrid conversation now. Okay, Jane, the floor is yours.
Okay. I think I kind of a question for everyone, although you know, if you don't have anything to say in response to the question, that's fine. So now there's a lot of you. And it really comes out of your talk, Suyun, which is just to throw some words that I think that you addressed very well, to do with, you know, stepping out of actor network kind of approaches, but into geopolitics and spectacularity, all the things that you get when you talk about the Cold War, and institutions and that kind of thing, because I think you showed very well how, you know, standardization is a political thing. You know, to standardize is to say this place is normal, and to standardize is to say this place is normal as opposed to China. In that case, so there's a spectacularity with that as well. So, Suyun, you might be given a free pass on this question because you've already talked about all of those things. You know, I'd like to hear if you ever want to say, but I'd be interested in hearing if those kinds of questions come up elsewhere as well. And it doesn't have to be geopolitical power, but I suspect that geopolitical forms of power are present every time you try to build something that is global, you know, that you don't get a globe really without geopolitics. I mean, Clay, you mentioned USA, which is a geopolitical organization par excellence, really, in a very financialized and neoliberalized way. Or you know, European institutions, in your case. So, does anyone want to riff on those kinds of questions, or are they just not really present in what you're doing?
I mean, as far as the French-Arizona collaboration is concerned, there's definitely a geopolitical idea of global research. Like France wants to, I mean, I'll let Laura complement if you have a complementary idea about the French politics of science, but they want to, you can see there's a national institute that collaborates with one state. They're approximately the same size like Arizona and France, but they can't get Harvard or MIT so they were going for a public university like the University of Arizona, and they're doing a very strong collaboration with French National Research Institute. So I think, I don't know how to analyze this perfectly, but I think there's one thing of like saying, yeah, we're going to a place that's kind of promising in terms of, you know, France is going to burn one day with climate change. Arizona is already hot, so we might like, you know, get advanced knowledge about how it's what it's about, and like, you know, promote French global diplomacy in a day where everything is Anglophone. So I don't know, there's few bits like I don't know how to articulate it in a coherent manner, but there's definitely something around that.
Yeah, it might just not be as spectacular as the politics that Siyun was talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I don't know if Law or
Maybe you said something in your talk about the American side of things was quite different
yeah.
in the way that the platforms are set up or
Yeah.
something, and what was that about? Was that related to, is geopolitics and also cultural geography? And I don't know, how, you didn't have, as an anthropologist, I'm also an anthropologist, I was wondering, where does culture fit in to this? And, but I think geopolitics is also.
In this, it fits with the relationship with quote unquote nature in terms of wilderness versus history of colonization, I think, in the sense that relationship to land and territory is definitely not the same in Europe. Places made small with the urbanization, and the history of colonization is a bit different because Europeans have gone elsewhere to go and colonize places and brought things back to metropolis, while the US has been naturalized as an open air lab and museum. When I was in Arizona, something that struck me very much, and this is about the kind of spectacular aspect that everything in the US, and I've seen it in Hawaii, seems to me to be made very spectacular and visual, and there are as many museums as there are labs, because it feels like both of them are kind of articulated together. Even like this desert museum in Arizona, and like it's we're in a desert, but then like a museum with like the same thing, just putting an enclosure around this, and it's lots of botanical gardens, stuff like that. So it feels like the relationship to territory is very different. So it calls for a very like an outdoorsy type of science, while Europe feels more like kind of, I don't know, maybe this is a bit too dichotomous, but they're more used to experimentation as a tool because you have to go somewhere and generalize. So anthropology, the dialectics of other and self is the difference, I think.
The modularity
Yeah.
involved in France, yeah, seems to stand out compared to the American.
Yeah.
Where everything seems kind of heavy set and
Yeah.
and immobile.
Well, the Montpellier one is a bit more like the American. It's not set in mobile, but still like, it's not the reason that Montpellier and Paris are not part of the same politics. Paris is the center of France. That's where theory, philosophers, kind of rationalized Cartesian stuff happened, where Montpellier had more freedom to investigate stuff in a more naturalist manner, and maybe with many more connections with the United Kingdom. I've been told many times in interviews that people in Montpellier did read Darwin and are part of this, history of Saint versus Paris being so specific with like pride and Claude Bernard and other like scientists. And I don't know a lot about his history, but there's definitely like different trenches of French science within France and also like the position of France as a way of processing science compared to other countries. I don't know if Law has things to add.
So this does have some, it goes back to the history of colonization, different kinds of colonization.
Well, I don't know if I can make a direct connection between Claude Bernard and colonization. It's a bit of a wide, but I think there are two different things. There's this idea of theory, and that's something that's different from between French universities and cities, and this idea of territory. And I don't know if things are explained very consistently, but yeah, they probably come together in what that for a broader historical analysis, I think. Anyone else want to react on these broad questions about geopolitics and culture? Laure or Clay, Laure from Phenomenal France, if I have pure wisdom about the country.
I can just quickly add that I see meta-analysis as a way of doing geopolitics by other means, to borrow that sort of famous phrase, and that in order to have a vote or in order to bring your issue to the table in a world that's dominated by meta-analysis, a country or an NGO will have to follow the sort of rules about how to make their knowledge legible. And I'm yet to fully elucidate what all of those rules are or what all their impacts are, but certainly it has major political and geopolitical implications as just a new form of deciding what is true and who gets to contribute to deciding what works as a global policy.
Yeah, Thank you for the question. So what I can say on this topic of geopolitics is that when it comes to soil carbon data, there is definitely some geopolitical stakes, because soil carbon stocks are not only interesting in a climate change perspective, they also give a lot of information regarding the fertility of soils, and therefore a lot of countries were actually quite reluctant to share their data on soil carbon stocks at an international level. And for example, for quite a few years, I think France did not want to share its data on soil carbon stocks to the Agriculture and Food Organization, which was trying to build an international soil carbon stock map. And France did not want to share its data because they thought it would give too much information on where are the best soils, like the most fertile soils and things like that. So there are definitely some geopolitical underlining to these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's a difficult trace, but, biosphere 2 is meant, we are in biosphere 1, inhabiting the world that we're in. Biosphere 2 is meant as like a generalizing global statement about, human survival and carrying capacity, but it's very difficult to trace the V2 vision from 40 years ago almost into specific scientific practices in the present.
Yeah.
But it's there, sort of haunting us.
It must be because Biosphere 2 is spectacle par excellence. And it's a theatre project, really.
Right.
Initially, right?
And also, it's when you see the logo, it's not the whole biosphere. You see America. So it means it's very much like if you map the idea of old continent and new continent, like old continent is biosphere 1, and biosphere 2 being actually the discovery of America. And to me, it felt a lot like this.
Yeah. But then sort of tracing that into a specific experiment or specific set of observations is a little more subtle.
Yeah, but people must be aware of it somehow.
It's it depends, like the leadership who needs to continue to fund projects have this, and it's a resource that they deploy. These associations with Progress in the Globe, and that the in-dirt researchers don't necessarily invoke that.
Thank you.
I have a question, and they're very partially articulated, but I guess I wanted to ask you all to think about or hear your thoughts on the relationship of these projects of kind of amalgamation and building consensus through extracting knowledge from specific contexts and maybe in particular ways to work such as the works of Max Lieberman around the kind of this kind of extractivism in knowledge as a colonial move, and how it relates to the title of your panel uses the term emplacement, and thinking of the role of place and the irreducibility of place and the kind of claiming of knowledge is from place through making them move in particular ways. So kind of coming across in several of the talks this kind of building towards consensus as a value and building towards anything like in the talk around meta-analysis, towards unity, generalization, and just wanted to kind of ask you to amplify, I guess, in the different presentations that aspect and how it comes forward in this work or I could
I think about that in the idea about stakeholders. Many of the projects that I've been involved with have engaged stakeholders, which are always non-academic others, and they're not to grossly dichotomize it, but there's generally an approach that is extractive. Like, let's extract information from these people, do something that makes them happy, but do what we want to do. Versus like really deep committed, community-based, deep ethnography, respectful kinds of work. And I've been approached for a whole bunch of the extractive models, right? The scientists aren't necessarily ready to commit to the actually deeply inclusive models of stakeholders. But, you know, sort of an extractive, the good old bad old extractive anthropology comes back in this. Or can come back, doesn't have to, but.
Maybe you see you have ideas about, because you mentioned colonial medicine, so I suppose it's very well to the question.
On the way here, I was just thinking that I heard something about the local and the global, or the local and the metropole. But I haven't thought much about emplacements in this space. Although I did find it very intriguing when I was looking through all these papers that were written at the time in the 1950s. You know, I was expecting to see that maybe more of a break from the colonial period, but actually I saw a lot of continuities, and that the Taiwanese physician researchers, they were trying to incorporate what they had from the colonial time and what was going on. You know, that was pushing so hard by the Americans. You know, this isotopes, the globalization. So that for me, it was very interesting that I see this kind of coming together of all this research. And I also was very intrigued to find a case of Mendoza that was actually, you know, put together Boston and Mendoza in Taiwan. I thought that was great.
Those Cold War politics of, I think somebody mentioned the theatrical side of things, you know, the presentation, spectacular nature of it. That it seems like that was taking place in Taiwan as just part of the American imperial network. That they, you know, that, oh, we got this new facility, let's take pictures and all that. But what was actually happening in Taiwan, the technology is being adapted or it's present now. We've received it as a gift from USAID and all that. But the colonial era actual surgery techniques and so on continued on. And those were actually, they continued to be more popular than the high-tech isotope version. You know, just cutting something out instead of using a higher technology with isotope.
In terms of treatment,
yeah, so you've got the political theatrical side of things, with big machines, expensive stuff. We need these radiologists and all these, you know, physicists and whoever involved. But the surgeons, the medical side of it, just, you know, trudged along with their old colonial paradigm.
yeah, I have in another paper I wrote about the first iodine 131 pill was given to the patient by the director of Taiwanese ABC and also the MOE director. And then the newspaper, the way it was portrayed was like he was dropping an atomic bomb. So that was really, it was ironic in many sense. And he wasn't a physician, but he was in the, supposedly by law, he should be the physician to give to the patient. But because it was treated like a theater, and so they have to use this big official, the head of the ANC and also head of MOE to do the ceremony. And that's how they describe it.
This made me think of the work of a colleague back in France who's worked on Indian hospitals and how nuclear medicine has become a big part of their RNSC, I think is the name in English, in India, and like how they've been like modeling the new hospitals after temples exactly in ceremonial manner, but with like this idea of this is a city that President Modi wants to invest a lot in, and so they made cancer treatment with nuclear medicine, whereas it's not necessarily what people need. But so I was like also curious about like how much of this is tied to kind of like, because it was funded by Tata, the car industry, and a lot of this was related to nuclear power. So I was wondering how much, because you explained all the convergences in the professor-teacher student relationship, but the importance of nuclear ideas behind it, I wasn't really sure why, apart from like some copying of the Americans or like some of this new technology, or maybe there are some advantages, but what about the nuclear is there that kind of like makes it politically, geopolitically important to invest in this? Because Fabian in front was saying this is all about the nuclearization of the absorbed through the medical setting. So I don't know how much of this was also important in your Taiwanese case.
it was kind of there was a mixed images of nuclear science and on the one hand, you see lots of people promoting nuclear science, and they treat it almost like the AI of 1950s. Everything would be changed if you introduce nuclear science, including nuclear power. And they describe this as the new thing that we should do because we have to catch up with the world and all that. But on the other side, I think that there was because of there was the hydrogen bomb that was being done just a few years before this, and there was some kind of accident that some Japanese fishermen they had this disaster, and there was also this notion, well, we have to be careful. But this kind of voice is much more contained because that's not what the government wanted and not the American wanted. So there was this kind of complex reaction attitude to this. But of course, if you look at the elites, they are going to, because they're positioned within the state apparatus, they are going to say, yeah, we should try to reduce this, and this is good for us. And it's a lot cheaper, and this is going to help with, especially the nuclear medicine, because sort of the model representative of the peaceful uses of nuclear science. So that makes it more so for them to say, we should do that.
There's that positive valence put on the atomic bombs, right? Just in the neighborhood of Taiwan, Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the devastation of that. And most people would think you would take that in a very negative light, and it's hard to come back from that atrocity, human rights atrocity. But then the positive side becomes, okay, but now we're spreading this atomic technology around Asia and the world, and it's another kind of bomb, and it was used in that way, in a metaphor, positive metaphor. The distribution of technology as a bomb is being like a metaphorical bomb. It seems really incredible.
And thank our remote speakers
Yeah.
and our present speakers.
Thank you.
There's some really great threads that go
Yeah.
across those, so thank you guys.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
We'll miss us online for lunch, but thank you again so much, and
So,
I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks for joining and for your great presentations. We'll be in touch if we like Jen suggested, we could like think about special issues or work like that, so we keep the conversation going. But yeah, you have the email thread of everyone, so we'll be looking forward to any feedback or discussion you want to keep going.
Great. Thank you so much.
you.
Enjoy your
Thank
lunch.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Energy that